Good afternoon. This is Rabbi Joshua Neely from Temple Israel. For those of you that are usual watchers of our YouTube, you probably will have noticed that we've had some technical difficulties over the last few weeks. So I'm trying something a little bit different to make up for the failed recording from last Wednesday's discussion of Parashat Bereishit, of the parasha for the first section of the book of Genesis. I'm going to go ahead and do a recap of what we studied in our class, and this will not be quite as involved or as extensive as our usual discussions, but it's such an important parasha, and I believe such an important topic, that I didn't want to let a whole week go by, let alone an entire year, without sharing these ideas with those of you who can't make it here on a week-by-week basis. So without further ado, I will do my best to try and recapture the spirit of our give-and-take discussion from the class and condense it into this video format. So when we begin our discussion of Parashat Bereishit, we are struck initially by a question that has been pondered by Jewish commentators for 3,000 years, which is, why are we bothering to learn this? Why did God bother to lay out creation at the beginning of the Torah? It may seem like an obvious notion now that we should begin with Bereishit, but it is not self-evident without making a number of assumptions. So throughout history, there have been quite a few different interpretations of why this was done. One was to establish the credentials and the authority of Torah. After all, why should we listen to Torah without knowing who the author was? This is the interplay that we have seen over and over again throughout history between conflating author and authority. That we will only take the book serious if we take the author seriously. And therefore, to establish the authority of Torah, we have to establish the credentials of the author. In this case, the credentials being the creation of the entire universe. Pretty good credentials, and creates a great deal of authority. Another explanation for why the Torah begins with the creation of the world comes around the idea of theft. There have been many midrashim written that in order for us to understand why it is and to accept why it is that God gave us the land of Israel, we have to first understand that God owned the land of Israel along with the rest of reality. And so beginning this Torah with the description of God's creation is an explanation of what is going to come later, is an explanation of the gift of the land of Israel and the allotment of lands to all the peoples of the world, is built around this idea that God is the creator. Finally, one of the other explanations that has been advanced throughout history is that we learn the stories of creation because we want to know the order of creation. May seem self-evident, may seem obvious, but there are many who argue that God wanted us to know that there was something that happened on day 1, something that happened on day 2, something that happened on day 3, etc., etc., etc. And that the only way we would know, since we weren't there, would be if God were to give us a record of what happened when God was the only entity that was experiencing this time of creation. So day 1, day 2, day 3, we get a nice, clean order for creation, and therefore we have an understanding of the sequence of events. All of these have been advanced by different Jewish authors, but most of our authorities, and as we're going to see, many of our most famous and authoritative writers, don't dwell on this, any of these, as being the main thing that we should take. In fact, there is a very long-standing principle within Jewish thinking and within Torah scholarship that if you settle for a relatively superficial, surface reading of Torah, of why the verses are there and what they have come to teach, that you are doing a disservice to Torah and that you are doing a disservice to God and not properly digesting and taking everything you can from the text. So we're going to look a little bit differently at this section of creation to see what we can learn. But first, just to point out, there's a few of the texts that go along with this in the handout. The first text to drive this home for us comes from Rashi. And Rashi says, Scripture did not come to teach the sequence of creation, to say that these came first, and etc., right? What we were just talking about. For if it came to teach this, then it should have written at first, Berishonah, he created the heavens and earth. But that's not the way it's written, but instead it's written Bereishit. And there is no Reshit, there is no usage of that Hebrew word in all of Tanakh and all of the scriptures that is not connected to the following word. That is to say, it is a conjunctive word, that its meaning can only be understood by the word that comes next, and it is limited and guided in understanding by the next word, rather than simply introducing a list that will be self-supporting. Therefore, says Rashi, you have to admit that Scripture did not teach us anything about the sequence of the earlier and the later. I know this has become a rather controversial topic in the modern days because many people see a faith in 7 24-hour days of a literal order of creation as being the litmus test for being faithful. That's a very new proposition within Judaism, turning it into a litmus test, I mean. And it's very important to recognize that traditionally, the main thing we were supposed to get from the story of creation wasn't a sequence of events. And Rashi brings that home very, very clearly. Just in case you don't quite get that, though, we can go on to Ramban, who was a commentator in the Middle Ages. And he says, it was necessary to begin the Torah with the chapter of creation, for this is the root of faith. For one who does not believe in this and think that the world is eternal, denies the essential principle of religion and has no Torah at all. It may seem odd to us who have grown up with the Big Bang Theory as the obvious scientific principle of creation and the globally accepted idea that the world was created at some point, if it was 14 billion years in the past or thereabouts. But for most of the scientific community's history, that is to say from Aristotle until the 20th century, the world, the universe was believed to be eternal. It was believed to have a beginning, and that it was believed not to have a beginning. It was believed to have been there forever, infinite. And the idea that the Torah would say there was a beginning was considered very anti-science, was considered very anti-rational. And what Ramban is reminding us is that creation itself as an idea, not necessarily the order and the sequence and the literalness, but creation itself as an idea is a principle for believing in God, for connecting to God through our faith, and for understanding the essential principle, and that without this, not the sequence, but without creation, that we're not going to be able to fully integrate, accept, and understand the rest of the Torah. But that doesn't mean, says Ramban, that it's going to be easy. As he continues, the process of creation is a deep mystery, not to be understood from the verses, and it cannot be known truly except through the tradition. If you think that you can open up the Torah and that from its verses alone and just your own sense of what these words probably mean, if you think that you can truly understand the depths of the mysteries of creation, then you are deluding yourself. In fact, the only way to truly understand this is through rigorous study of our traditions that have been passed down for centuries, and through discussing those with other human beings. Relying upon just your own intuition, your own sense of what's probably right or probably wrong, is going to get you into trouble, as we are going to see when we get into this. So we're going to discuss just one little section, because, as Ramban said, this is a profound mystery, which means there's no way that we're going to be able to cover all of it. But if you look at verse 2 of chapter 1 of Genesis, it says that v'ha'aretz hayta tohu vavohu. It says that the world, the earth, the eretz was tohu vavohu. Now the often translation of that is that the earth was unformed and void. that it was chaos, that it was shapeless, formless, and empty. There are many different translations you'll find in many different books, primarily because these words are not consistently used or frequently used throughout the rest of the Bible. And because they are unusual words, it means that we don't have as clear from pure context an understanding of what they mean, which means we are required to rely upon our tradition to help us to begin to unravel what this tohu vavohu is talking about, what this unformed and void is really trying to teach us. That same verse goes on to say that Veruach Elohim, that the Spirit of God, or the wind of God, depending upon your translation, mirachefet al penei hamayim, that it moved across, that it swept across, or that it hovered over the face or surface of the water. The fact that every word that I'm translating here has one or two or three other English words should already give you a clue that this is not something that's going to be easily unraveled, but we are going to do our best. So the first text that we're going to look at is from the collection of Midrashim, Bereishit Rabbah, and it begins with Rav Yossi bar Rav Chanina. So Rav Yossi bar Rav Chanina said, "Whoever elevates himself at the cost of another's degradation has no share in the world to come." This is a very straightforward proposition, and one that's repeated in many different ways throughout rabbinic literature, that we are not supposed to insult, to belittle, or to grade other people. And all the more so if we were to elevate ourselves only by pushing someone else down, that is to say, make ourselves look good at someone else's expense, that we have no place in the world to come, that this is a wholly unrighteous act. But he goes on to build on that theme in a broader context and says, how much more then the glory of God? That is to say, how could you imagine building yourself up by denigrating God? If you're not allowed to build yourself up by denigrating another human, then all the more so you shouldn't do so by denigrating God. And what is written after it, he says? In human practice, when an earthly ruler builds a palace on a site of sewers, dunghills, and garbage, if one says, this palace is built on a site of sewers, dunghills, and garbage, isn't that disparaging it? I'm just going to check the recording. It made a little bit of a noise, and we've had trouble, so I'm hoping it's still okay. Looks like it is. But the point should be clear, that if you remind somebody of the filth upon which a palace was built, that's generally not considered to be a compliment. It's taking away something from the beauty and grandeur of the palace. Thus, whoever comes to say that this world was created out of tohu and vohu, that was created out of this chaos, this void, this formlessness, and the darkness, does he not indeed impair and disparage? Aren't you disparaging creation? The palace that God has given us, if it was built out of tohu vavohu, then isn't that disparaging? Now, the answer, of course, is no, because it's written in the Torah, therefore we are merely repeating what we have been taught, and repeating what you have been taught properly is never a problem. But it does give us this other hint about this idea that the world was built from tohu and vohu, that they were not merely adjectives describing some state of existence, but that they are elements of creation. And for that, we need to go on to Ramban. Now, if you've read any other Ramban, you'll know that Ramban leans towards the mystical in many places, but mystical does not mean you can't understand it. So please pay attention, read along with the handout, and I'm sure that we're going to get through this. So listen, he says, to the correct and clear explanation of the verse in its simplicity. And by the way, you should always know, anytime an author says the correct and clear explanation, it means that what's about to be said is not going to be clear at all, and you're going to have to work for it. If it was really that clear, the author wouldn't have to state it. The Holy One created all things from absolute non-existence. Everything under the sun or above was not made from non-existence. Now, those two sentences seem to create a contradiction. At one time saying that it was created from absolute non-existence, and in the next sentence saying that everything was not made from non-existence. What in the world is Ramban trying to say? Well, this is what he means. Instead, God brought forth from nothingness a thin substance devoid of corporeality, but having a power of potency, fit to assume form and to proceed from potentiality into reality. And God formed things with it. Know that the heavens and all that is in them consist of one substance, and likewise the earthly things. These two substances alone were created, and all else was constructed from them. In Hebrew, it is called tohu. All right, so let's see if we can't unravel this. So what Ramban is trying to point out is that A, God did not work from pre-existing materials. This again was an ancient canard of philosophers saying that whatever God may have created, he created with something that pre-existed his acts of creation. Similar to a child being given a set of Legos, and then the child builds something from the Legos, you would have to admit the child didn't make the Legos himself, that he or she got them and then created their wonderful structure. Well, so too many of the ancient philosophers argued that God began from something else and then made our wonderful world, but didn't create it from scratch. Ramban points out, no, God did create the world from scratch, but he didn't create each and every item within the world from scratch directly. That's what he's trying to say here. It's not like God suddenly said, let there be a tree, and let there be a mountain, and let there be a bird, and that each of these were simply winked into existence from non-existence. Instead, says Ramban, based upon our tradition, that God created, pardon my limited artistic ability, something called tohu. And tohu, this chaotic primordial substance that lacked a form but had a power to be real, was what was first made. And from this wonderful, giant, amorphous, non-corporeal substance, which is, yes, I know, hard to wrap our heads around, God then made tree, mountain, and bird. That it came from them. That this was created first, that second sentence of the Torah, and then everything else that comes afterwards came from it. The only part where we get into a little bit more confusion is where Ramban says, that we have tohu that creates our birds, our mountains, our trees, sorry for the mislabeling, and that we also have some sort of tohu that creates our stars, sun, and moon. And that there was one substance used to create the heavens and one substance to create the world. This seems odd to us, but this was a standard understanding of this for many, many centuries. And indeed, when we go back and we look at the arguments against Galileo and all of that, one of the main arguments that was brought forth was based upon a belief that there was a bright red line in existence between the material world on earth and the spiritual world, the ephemeral world of the heavens above. And in church doctrine in particular, that was a literal understanding that everything up above the earth existed from a different form of substance, that it wasn't even made from the same building blocks as our world was. That's why when Galileo looked at the moon through a telescope and said, looks like it's got mountains, it was considered to be rather revolutionary and heretical, because it implied, rightly so, that the things in the heavens were made from the same building blocks, the same atoms we would call it, as the things down on earth. And the medieval church didn't really appreciate that idea. But what are we going to do in Judaism for this as well? Well, to take that, we need to go ahead and look at the next page on our handout. So we go on to the Rav Abahu quote, and he tries to draw our attention to this apparent dichotomy and the problem that's inherent in it. So Rav Abahu says, this is also in Bereishit Rabbah, this, meaning creation, may be compared to the case of a king who bought two slaves on the same bill of sale at the same price. One he ordered to be supported at the public expense, while the other he ordered to toil for his bread. The latter, the one who's toiling, sat bewildered and astonished, which, by the way, is being used as a play on words for tohu vavohu, and said, "Both of us were bought at the same price," he exclaimed. "Yet he is supported from the treasury, while I have to gain my bread by my toil." Thus the earth sat bewildered and astonished. He's emphasizing in his close reading of the text that the Hebrew says, "V'ha'aretz haita tohu vavohu," that the earth was bewildered and astonished. And he's saying the celestial beings and the terrestrial ones were created at the same time. Yet the celestial beings are fed by the radiance of the Shekhinah, of God's presence, whereas the terrestrial beings, if they do not toil, do not eat. So he's drawing an analogy here, saying that if you had two people, and one of them worked, didn't have to work at all, rather, and everything was handed to them, and the other had to work constantly in order to just stay alive, this guy would probably think it was unfair. If they were valued the same, if they were respected the same, then why in the world should this guy have it so easy and this guy have it so hard? And this is an essential complaint that we as human beings have. Why should it be that the heavenly realm, the spiritual realm, and in particular our conception of angels, why should they have it easy when we have it hard? Now, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but the main point that we're drawing on right now is it's reinforcing this notion of two worlds, which is the other quote from Bereishit Rabbah. We say, why was the world created with a bet? That is to say, the first letter of the Torah, to teach you that there are two worlds, that there is a world above and that there's a world below, not literally, but spiritually versus materially. But now let's see if we can begin a little resolution, if we can begin to draw this together. And if we're going too fast, I apologize again. As I said in the introduction, normally this would take about an hour's worth of study and discussion, and we're only up to just about 20 minutes. So hopefully you're holding on. If not, review it or leave a comment below and I can try and explain it better. So Radak, another medieval commentator, goes on to say, while heaven was created in a perfect state to symbolize life, the earth, meaning the material world, symbolized death. The four basic elements of which the earth consists are inert, dead substances. They possess no will or intelligence of their own. They have been built with certain natural properties and cannot vary them. Strong stuff that's easily misunderstood or applied. When Radak is saying that the heavens were there to symbolize life and that the earth symbolizes death, he doesn't mean the earth is bad. He doesn't mean that the earth is some terrible dead place that we need to leave in order to go to true life in a heavenly spiritual sense. What he is trying to say is, what is life and what is lifeless? What are things that are inherently lifeless? And he looks around earth and he says, well, when you look at the basic structure of things on earth, like mountains, like rocks, like water, they have no life. They sit there and they are inert. They are unthinking. They have no will, no volition of their own. They are simply dead. And yet the things that are in the spiritual realm, that are in the heavenly sphere, they seem to have no body, but will, intelligence, and life. What we consider to be life, the most important aspects of life, that which is moving and changing and giving this wonderful pulsing vibrance. But notice the implied conclusion that comes from Radak's statements. Because even though he says that the earth itself is inert, that the substances which make up earth are lifeless, when we look around, there is life. That is to say, when I talk to another person, when I see a bird in flight, when I see a tree growing and moving in the wind, when I see something growing from the ground which I can then eat and sustain myself with, I see life. When I talk to people, I recognize they have will and they have intelligence. So where did that come from if the basic building blocks of earthliness were lifeless? And the answer, of course, comes from this whole section of Torah, which is to say that the tohu that was used to create the heavenly sphere, the spiritual sphere, and the tohu that was used to create the earthly sphere, as Ramban implied on the first page of our handout, are one substance. They were used in two different ways to create material and spiritual, but there is an inherent bond and binding between the tohu of the spiritual and the tohu of material. And when it says explicitly that God breathed life into the lifeless earth to create man, what is being described there is one of the most sublime metaphors of the mystery of life. That which is inherently inert is given spirit and will, intelligence and life because of the gift of God, of transforming that lifeless matter into willing and living creatures. And that mystery is something that we gaze past every day, and we miss it. Which is why in Bereishit Rabbah we get a story about Shimon ben Zoma. And it says that it once happened that Shimon ben Zoma was standing, wrapped in speculation, when Rabbi Yoshua passed and greeted him once and a second time without his answering him. Ben Zoma is completely lost in his meditative state. At the third time, finally Ben Zoma hears it and he answers him in confusion. Sort of the, huh? What? Who? What means this, Ben Zoma? says Rabbi Yoshua. And Ben Zoma replies, I was contemplating the creation and have come to the conclusion that between the upper and the nether waters there is but 2 or 3 finger breadths. For is it not written here that the Spirit of God blew, but rather hovered, like a bird flying and flapping with its wings barely touching the nest over which it hovers. Let's make sure we understand this beautiful imagery that he is coming to the conclusion of. He says in this section where we talk about the Ruach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim, it doesn't say that God blew on the surface of the water. It said God hovered. And it says hover means proximity. Hover means closeness. An airplane at 30,000 feet is not hovering over the earth. A hovercraft is specifically called because it hovers literally above the surface of the ground. But if it says that God, which is considered to be, of course, more in line with the spiritual realm than the material, we can talk about that another time, is hovering over the surface of the waters, then that must mean there isn't far to go between the surface of the waters and the spiritual realm. In fact, only 2 or 3 finger breadths between. So rather than imagining this insurmountable and essentially unbreachable gulf between the material and spiritual, what Ben Zoma had realized is that the two worlds were not parted by much at all. In fact, we wouldn't even say they were parted by a physical divide. They are parted by a spiritual apprehension, a spiritual understanding, which is why Rabbi Joshua continues in our story to say, he turns to his disciples and remarks to them, Ben Zoma, the son of Zoma, has gone. And a few days later, and Ben Zoma was in his home. And home here is a euphemism for the grave and for returning to the spiritual world purely. He died. Ben Zoma understood this truth so deeply, perhaps too deeply, our tradition would argue, that he could no longer remain attached to the physical world, but allowed himself to drift wholly into the spiritual. Now, this is not our goal. This is not what we seek before it's time. When it's time, yes, of course, we will go on to the world to come, but an understanding that there is no essential difference between the spiritual and the material, that there is no essential divide, let alone disparagement between one or the other, is a very important concept to begin to understand and to take on board. And this is just from the first 2 lines of the Torah. So many people move through them simply thinking they're going to get to the order of the days, find out when the animals were made, argue about when there was light and when there were planets and stars, and glide past one of the most profound teachings the Torah is trying to give us in this first chapter. When we dwell only on the surface, we are missing the grandeur that God gave us. When we dwell only on the surface of our material world, we fail to appreciate that the spiritual is only a finger breadths away. When we dwell only on the surface of the text, we fail to realize that just behind those letters, there is a spiritual symphony taking place, and that they're not merely given to us to argue about what was and was not literal. So please make sure that you embrace that spiritual dimension, to scrape just that tiny surface away, to recognize that the tohu that is embodied in us as well as in the heavenly spiritual realm is one and the same, and that is our ultimate calling and the ultimate purpose of our creation. I hope this came out and the recording worked okay. Take care.